So I recently did a float session, which was amazing. I highly recommend it if you have a float spa nearby. But it really showed me a lot about my story that I wanted to share with you guys and why it's actually really beneficial. First, I just want to lay the groundwork. I want to talk about a little bit of the history and a little bit of the definition of the functionality of a float session. More specifically, a float tank. What is a float tank? And I swear to God, if I hear a tank that floats in the comments section, I mean, you're not wrong, but come on, man. A float tank is essentially a pod or a chamber or a room of some kind that's filled with just two things: Epsom salt and water that is heated to your body temperature. That's important, and I'll get into it in a second, but that's it. So a float tank, a proper float tank, is also designed to be pitch black when you close it and soundproof. So you can't see anything, you can't hear anything, and because the water is the same temperature as your body, you can't feel anything. And because of the Epsom salt, if you've been in salt water, you float in salt water. If you've been somewhere like the Dead Sea, you're gonna feel like a feather. And that's the point of a float tank. You float and that's it. And that's where the history comes in, actually. That's why float tanks were invented. So they were created by an American neuroscientist named Dr. John C. Lilly, I think is his name. And he invented the tank in the 1950s, and from the very limited research that I'd done, he had been working on this thing until the 70s, really designing and building up the prototypes. But he did it to test a certain hypothesis, and that hypothesis was, are conscious states still active when there's no external stimuli? Meaning, is the conscious mind still going when there's nothing to keep it going, right? That's also why float tanks are called sensory deprivation tanks. They are tanks literally designed to deprive you of using your senses. And sometimes it's not always entirely true. I mean, if you do a float session, you can still feel the salt sometimes, especially when you come out of it, like you're like white from all the salt that seeps in. Sometimes you get earplugs, so you can feel the earplugs. And even though you can still feel a little bit of the connection from where the water touches your skin, you don't really feel it, right? Because you're always used to a cold pool or shower where it's the impact of the water plus the incongruent temperature. You don't get that with a float tank. And you really start to let your senses be deprived after about 15 minutes. And usually sessions are about 60 to 90 minutes. So you're there for what it feels like a long time. Like, I cannot tell you how excited I got when I realized that my leg was itchy. Like, I just got one itch on the side of my thigh and I went, thank you, God, something. I got something. But there's a lot of value in a float session. And I really think it shows you your physical or your physiological story and your mental story too. Now, keep in mind, I'm not saying that float tanks are a good diagnostic tool or, they're good to be prescribed or that they're a good prescription for something. Rather, this is me showing that float tanks are actually really beneficial, especially if you are go all the time. You're sucked into that hustle culture mindset. Or if you're like me, you're on your feet working long ass hours a night. So it's a good way to relax and almost it acts like a giant reset button. But what I found is it helped me expose a lot of stories that I didn't know were there. So let's start with the surprising one. Let's start with the physical and the physiological stories. Because you're floating, there is nothing for your body to resist. And that's weird because that's the story that your body knows. Even if it's something tiny, like I'm wearing 2 layers right now. My body is almost pushing, right, in a sense, or it has to carry the weight of these clothes, right? When I'm sitting down, it's feeling the resistance of the chair. When I'm lying down, it's feeling the resistance of the ground. When I'm standing, it almost feels like I have to work against gravity sometimes. And obviously you don't get that in a float tank. I mean, occasionally sometimes if you don't, if you get in the wrong way, you'll be like me where you just kind of zone out and then it'll turn into that. But what I found is when I came out of the float tank, I was sore. Like the same kind of soreness that you get after a massage. And it's because every muscle is allowed to relax. And I know this firsthand when I was floating and I could feel my neck just suddenly go but it's because it realized that it didn't have to carry the weight of my head anymore, right? It was able to just float by itself and just be there and be totally calm and totally relaxed. But it was a good way to see the story of what my body was saying. You know, it really is true. Your body keeps the score. Float tanks for me were a great way to see where the score was being kept in my body, right? So I noticed there was a lot of soreness in my legs. There was a lot of soreness in my lower back. There was a lot of soreness in my neck and my shoulders. And it's because that's where the most stress and the most tension was. So now that I was able to know that, I was able to say, okay, let's change that story so my body can work a little bit better. Now I target those spots specifically when I stretch or when I relax or when I go get a massage, right? Or when I do acupuncture or whatever it is to keep my body as functional as possible. I target those places specifically because that's the story that my body is telling me. It's saying, hey, we're low on energy in these parts. Let's change that. And because there wasn't anything to distract myself with, the float tank really helped open up that story for me. Which leads me to the next thing, and the reason why float tanks were invented, and that's the mental story. Some people have a lot of very, very interesting reactions with a float tank. One of my favorite examples of this is Hamilton's Pharmacopoeia, which is a Vice show, I think it's on HBO, or sorry, Max, where the host does a sensory deprivation experience, and it actually is really profound. Rhett Link did another one that was really good. Some people have spiritual or meditative experiences. For example, the hostess that was kind of walking me through my first float session told me that she was able to go as far back as being able to remember her locker code from middle school, right? But that's because, and at least from my experience, right? Maybe there still needs to be a little bit more research about this, but when there is no external stimuli for your brain to process and turn into a story, it goes internal. It has to look inward to almost entertain itself. So for a while, yeah, you do get this feeling of like, okay, are we done? I don't know what we're doing. And you know, it will get bored, but in order to occupy itself, it will fill in the blanks with certain thoughts. So now I'm feeding these stories of these ideas that I didn't realize I've ever had, or this personal philosophy that I didn't realize that was kind of generating or motivating my actions at the back of my mind, or certain memories that came up. And because those memories came up, I was able to actually take the time to process it and go, oh, that's why I do this, or that's why I have these beliefs. So from a mental standpoint, and you know, from a physiological standpoint too, float tanks are amazing because they shut everything out so you can pull everything forward and understand the stories that you're telling yourself. If you really have a tough time kind of unlocking that, I would highly advise a float tank. Again, if it's accessible to you. You know, float tanks were accessible to me for a while, but when they were, I jumped right on it. And float tanks aren't the only way to do this. You know, meditation is a great way to do this. It's just sensory deprivation is that to like cranked up to 11. But if you really do want to know the story that your body and your mind are telling you, and you really want to listen, try a float tank. Give a float session a shot. I really do think it's going to be beneficial to you. And that's all I got. I know I usually go on for days upon days, but I'm, you know, trying to be a little more mindful with the timing. So thanks for watching, guys. Hope you enjoyed it. If you did, subscribe, welcome, join the community. And yeah, I will see you in the next one. Get out of here.